First off, Associate Professor Lars Gule from Oslo Metropolitan University will talk about attitudes, beliefs, and rule of law, growth or stagnation after the Arab Spring. Gule is a Norwegian philosopher. He is graduated with a doctorate in philosophy and is an associate professor at the Oslo Metropolitan University. From 2000 to 2005, he was Secretary General of the Norwegian Humanist Association. Welcome, Lars.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And as mentioned, I've been asked to talk about attitudes, beliefs, and rule of law. And I understand these attitudes and beliefs to be religious beliefs in the main. But I start with the concept of rule of law. It has never been a strong factor in the Middle East and North Africa. This is a region distinguished with authoritarian monarchies and dictatorial presidents. So, in combination with corruption, fairly widespread corruption, which means that you are bending the law or you're bypassing the law, the rule of law has been very much absent in the Middle East. We have also seen impunity from crime and the abuse of power. Another example that the rule of law is absent. In a paradoxical sense, Iran, which we've heard more about earlier today, there is an emphasis on law, on Islamic law, draconian laws, but for religious reasons, those laws are implemented. If we should call that the rule of law, is debatable because we are not talking about the modern concept of rule of law based on human rights, international law. So, in short, the Middle East region has been characterized by human rights violations for decades, the absence of rule of law. And this did not change very much with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, as such, was a very broad protest movement, socially and politically. It brought hope to many for less corruption, less abuse, and more democracy and dignity. Dignity was one of the slogans, very important slogan, in several countries, in particular Egypt and Syria. Explicitly and implicitly, the protests were demands for the rule of law. Less corruption means adherence to the law. Democratization means influence, the possibility of participating in the making of laws, and dignity means that you should be treated as a citizen, not as a subject. So these demands were not seen in contradistinction to faith, to Islam. Islam was not important in the beginning. People's faiths were not important. In general, people were and are still Muslims. But the Islamists, those who articulate a particular Islamic program for social change, political system, etc., were not in the forefront of the protests. In the beginning, it changed eventually. But the slogans were not religious in the beginning. When the Islamists started to take part in the protests, this changed. Not necessarily very much in the beginning, but to a certain extent. And the lack of response from the regimes, in many cases, gave the Islamist groups, the non-violent as well as the more violent jihadis, a more prominent position in the protests. But it is also important to keep in mind that there was considerable variation from country to country. Faith, religious beliefs are important to most people in the Middle East and North Africa, but not necessarily the fundamentalist or Islamist varieties of religious beliefs. And this distinction between ordinary, everyday faith, everyday beliefs, their religious attitudes, often rather conservative, and as a legitimation of tradition, is important to the majority of people in the Middle East. Secularists, in the meaning of non-believers, atheists, are few and far between in the Middle East. However, the demand for secularization, accepting that faith is important for many people, but the state should not regulate religion, is a growing movement. And that is, in a sense, a secular movement, because it means that the state should stay away from religion and leave it to the individual to practice his or her faith. Most people are pragmatic or moderate, so to speak, in questions of faith and belief. Nevertheless, over the last 50 years or so, at least since the middle or end of the 1960s, there has been a growth in the influence of Islamist groups, both the peaceful and eventually the jihadi groups. This influence, this increasing influence, represents a critique of the established systems. So this was a pre-Arab Spring form of protest, that such groups gathered strength over time. And the rulers have seen this as a challenge, and they have increased their religious emphasis. They have tried to legitimate their rule by religious references, by making laws seemingly in accordance with Islamic beliefs. So this influence of faith over time was not stopped nor reversed by the Arab Spring, even though the Arab Spring itself was mainly a non-religious protest movement in the beginning. So we have seen the entrenchment of religious norms in different parts of legislation over the years, especially in family law. That is where the state does not mind giving over to the religious institutions to implement religious norms. But criminal law and other forms of legislation, the rulers have kept to themselves. But this increased religious influence on certain parts of law has had as a consequence an entrenchment of the discrimination of women. It has meant freezing gender roles, making it more difficult for women to participate in all spheres of society. There has been a growing emphasis on blasphemy and the illegality of blasphemy. And we have states in the Middle East where there is the death penalty, but at least there are crackdowns, there are jail sentences for people who coming forth as atheists, non-believers, or are seen as blasphemers. And we have also seen an increasing, but this is something that varies over time, but we have seen increasing persecution of gays. Let me just give a brief overview of a few countries in this process since the Arab Spring. In Tunisia, we saw definite democratization And the important thing here is that the most influential Islamist party, the Brotherhood variety, Muslim Brotherhood variety in Tunisia, called Ennahda, under the leadership of Rashid Ghannouchi, refrained from using violence and had done so for a number of years. They became a very important party. Between 30 and 40% of the electorate supported them. But Ghannouchi accepted the rules of democracy, could partake in government with non-religious parties, and also accept defeat at the polls. So this was actually a very encouraging sign. It was an example of peaceful, democratic, accepting Islamists. But they had competition. They had competition from more undefinable groups that was meddling in the social and political chaos also seen in Tunisia. So eventually Tunisia produced perhaps the largest contingent of foreign fighters traveling to Syria as the conflict in Syria developed. But not only did they have a very large contingent of both male and female Syria travelers, they also had a problem with, and you could say still have a problem with, Islamist terrorism at home. So the problems that have caused these developments have not disappeared. And of lately, we have heard of new demonstrations against the government, not now a regime, but a government, because of poverty, because of lack of economic progress. So the fundamental problems in Tunisian society has not been solved, but hopefully they can be taken care of within the newly established democratic framework in Tunisia. Egypt, the total opposite. From dictatorship to dictatorship, with a small interregnum of an Islamist rule, democratically elected, overwhelmingly elected actually. So now the situation is worse than before. There is definitely no rule of law, more political prisoners, more political sentencing if you are brought to trial in Egypt than before. And at the same time, Sisi, the dictator in Egypt, is also trying to use religion to legitimate his position by forbidding atheism and also by attacking gays. Arrested when they meet and persecuted and so on. Iraq, the other end of the Middle East from North Africa, after the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003, there has been a very, very slow process of democratization. The Arab Spring as such also had some repercussions in Iraq, but Iraq was more involved with its own internal conflicts, tensions, problems, uprisings and protests. With the growth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, turning into the Islamic State of Iraq. On the other hand, the majority, the Shia groups, have had a very great influence in politics, but the coalition or the system in Iraq is not overtly religious, simply because it has to cater for Kurds, Sunni Arabs, and the majority Shia Arabs. But we see Shia militias. The parties all often maintain militias, so they do have influence on everyday politics. And corruption is still an important and problematic part of the situation in Iraq, which means that rule of law is limited. And of lately, since the defeat of the Islamic State, we are seeing We are seeing kangaroo courts against alleged former fighters of the Islamic State. They have not proper trials, and they are swiftly executed. So this is making a mockery of any legal system. Syria was a brutal dictatorship, and it has turned even more brutal. No rule of law, which has been compounded by the civil war with extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and so on. The conflict has become more and more religious. And this is interesting because the Ba'ath regime in the beginning has presented itself as a modern secular movement, although the ethno-religious minority of the Alawites had a prominent position within the regime. This was downplayed. During the civil war, it has come to the forefront, and especially the opposition, as it grew more and more religiously oriented, has said that we are fighting unbelievers. The Alawites, a so-called theologically extremist sect within Shia Islam, not accepted as Muslims at all. And it's very interesting that even the so-called Free Syrian Army, consisting of numbers of groups, small and large militia groups, for the most part used religious symbols, icons, slogans to mark their identity, even though they said we are in favor of democracy, we are secularists, etc. It simply was not true. So the religious dimension has become the important one in Syria, with the emphasis of the two large, not the only, but the two largest groups, Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State that also moved into the chaotic situation in Syria. So the civil war created room for the Islamic State and the caliphate that was proclaimed in 2014, and that was the springboard for its offensive. The room that the Islamic State established for itself in Syria made it possible for them to return from where they came, Iraq, and also conquer large parts of Iraq in the summer of 2014. So even with the defeat of the opposition, it is definitely now the regime that is on the offensive in Syria. The ethno-religious conflict will not only remain, but will have grown in strength and relevance for the future of Syria. Unfortunately, the Sunni majority against the Alawite minority will remain a very, it is a recipe for future instability. So, the overall picture. The Arab Spring did not cause the increased influence of religion in politics. It was there already. It was a general trend that we had seen growing over several decades, first in the form of Muslim Brotherhood ideology and groups, and then more smaller jihadi groups, but they gained influence over politics to a certain extent. This was also a result of Saudi politics exporting the Wahhabi variety of Islam, a Salafi variety of Islam, through its oil wealth, not emphasizing it inside Saudi Arabia, but supporting oppositional groups in the countries in the Middle East. The jihad in Afghanistan was also an important factor in the growth of Islamist groups in the Middle East. And all of this resulted, in particular, the intervention in Afghanistan, supported by a number of Arab countries, Egypt and Saudi Arabia in particular, resulted in a Frankenstein's monster, we could say, because it turned back on them. Al-Qaeda became an oppositional group, both to Saudi Arabia and to Egypt, and it turned into global Salafi jihadism. which is a factor, and we have heard throughout this conference that we have to see it as remaining a factor in the Middle East and even globally, not only in the Arab world, but also larger parts of the Muslim world, and it could continue to represent a violent or terrorist threats also in other parts of the world. So while the Arab Spring, the initial causes and inspiration was in many ways secular demands against corruption, for the rule of law, more democracy, regime change. When the Islamists joined the protests, they did not succeed in establishing religious rule, neither in Tunisia or Egypt, nor Syria, Iraq. Actually, in no countries, the Islamists have been successful in taking over the movement. Nevertheless, the underlying causes for the Arab Spring are still there, even to an increased degree. Oppression breeds opposition. It can take time before it erupts, but oppression will result in counter forces. So, while Islamists could present itself as a real alternative to the established order before 2011, this has become more problematic since they did not succeed. They could not take over the movement and they could not establish themselves. So perhaps that is a glimmer of hope for the future, that the future protests will be more secular in its orientation. But the continued tension between conservative traditions, established religious mores, Islamism, and modernization and secular values and institutions, these tensions between these factors are still there. They are not going away. And these countries, these peoples in the Middle East will combat these tensions. They will strive with these tensions. So in combination with socioeconomic problems, these tensions indicate that we will see more problems and perhaps a new Arab Spring in the Middle East. Thank you for your attention.